The US has seen a number of political parties come and go. The Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, the Know-Nothings, the Prohibition Party, etc. However, one of the most famous of these now-defunct parties is the Whig Party. Founded as the National Republicans in 1836 by Henry Clay, the Whigs were generally defined by anti-Jacksonianism, support for protectionism and a national bank, and were something of a successor to the Federalists. However, like the rest of the US, they were torn apart over the slavery question, forcibly welded back together in 1856 as the Republican Party, though many Southern Whigs folded seamlessly into the Dixicrats of the time. However, the Whigs have endured in the American consciousness better than most failed parties, and that begs the question, what if they had survived? Now, we almost immediately hit a snag. The Whigs were internally divided from the start. The 1836 election, the first time they existed as a formal political party, saw them split among 4 candidates, wherein they got crushed by Democrat candidate and Jacksonian ally Martin Van Buren. Van Buren, however, was hit hard by the Panic of 1837, wherein speculation and a decline in cotton were made worse by Jackson's bank war and the end of the national bank as a result of it. This gave the Whigs a strong chance in 1840, capitalizing with Virginia-born but Ohio-based William Henry Harrison and John Tyler. However, those of you who have heard of Mr. Harrison know that he died a month in due to pneumonia after giving a 2-hour-long speech in the rain. Though Dr. Mike points out that his treatment, including bloodletting and forcing bodily expulsions, certainly did not help in this regard. Harrison's death sparked a constitutional crisis wherein Tyler insisted that he was the actual president, and Congress felt he was only acting president. This, the Whigs could accept. It was at least a little bit of semantics. However, Tyler almost immediately broke with the Whigs ideologically and vetoed 2 different national bank proposals. You know, the thing that the Whigs were elected to bring back? Like, your feelings on a bank of the US aside, that's just a dick move. So yeah, he was kicked out of the party before the 1844 election. Old Johnny Boy also exacerbated the question of annexing Texas, and eventually forced the issue, which led to the Mexican-American War and all that fun stuff. That being said, this is also a very easy point of divergence. Either it doesn't rain the day of the inauguration, or Harrison cuts his speech down to a reasonable level, because 2 hours is a lot even in the ideal conditions. What does he do from there? Well, he didn't like the idea of a strong presidency, and generally wanted to defer to Congress, which in this case will likely mean a hike in tariffs and reestablishment of the national bank in order to get the speculation and credit under control. And given that the US had a much smaller import market at the time, I think this could work at least somewhat. I would assume that the Third National Bank's first president / executive / whatever is someone sympathetic to states' rights, so as to soothe over the debate, though this man would likely be picked by Congress rather than the president, due to Harrison's anti-patronage stances. I do wonder how committed he would be to his parliamentarian thought if the Democrats won the 1842 midterms the way they did in real life. Though, to be fair, this victory is up for debate, even with the House shrinking after the 1840 census. The relative strength of the Whig-based recovery, rather than the division it faced under Tyler, could mitigate the losses in my opinion. Another problem for Harrison is that the Whigs were already divided even at this point. While Kentuckian Henry Clay was a nationalist who was politically removed from his plantation and advocated for gradual emancipation and a back to Africa scheme, check out last week's video for more about that, in order to support high tariffs and internal improvements, other members of the party were more or less only here due to disliking Jackson's style of politics or believing the bank was necessary. New Englander Daniel Webster became more in favor of moderate tariffs, hard money near exclusively, and while being personally anti-slavery, was disinterested in attacking it politically. While the Whigs were generally united against rabid expansionism, which would either mean a war with Britain or disproportionately favor the southern slaveholding states, Webster's comparative moderation meant that he became the face of these Cotton Whigs, those who were against attacking slavery and were often sympathetic to the institution politically. Even before the Mexican-American War brought this question to the forefront of the Whigs' survival, Clay and Webster were at each other's throats, vying for control over the party more or less the second Jackson was out of the way. And Harrison will have to make a choice over who to back in that struggle. Given that Webster was on his cabinet, and Harrison generally seemed to lean into this caucus, I think it's fair to extrapolate where this goes. Though a major break between Harrison and Webster would likely arise on the form of the national bank, since Webster disliked paper money, whereas one of Harrison's few stated positions was coming down in favor of it. Either way, Harrison also pledged to only serve 1 term as president, and I think that limits his power over the party's institutions. While he likely helps weed out the more wishy-washy Whigs who were too moderate regarding states' rights, and certainly attacks the free soil movement as it existed at the time, I'm not sure that's enough to get Webster complete control over the party. In fact, I think that the Northern Whigs are emboldened by this lean on the South, and favor a man like Clay for 1844. At the very least, the nominee won't be Zachary Taylor, since the Mexican-American War hasn't happened in this timeline yet. I think the Whigs would generally be in a favorable spot in this timeline to 44 due to the recovery and lack of the scandal-ridden Tyler to pull them down. However, at this point, the Texas question is getting to be a serious debate North and South. Tyler ultimately forced the issue in our timeline, leaving Polk to sort out the consequences of his actions via both the negotiation over Oregon and the war with Mexico. Somewhat frustratingly, I think a Clay presidency will be more similar to Polk than we'd want to admit. The division of Oregon was somewhat inevitable due to how many more Americans were in the territory than Brits, especially south of the Columbia River. I could see Clay angling to get Vancouver Island if he really, really wanted to, and that it might become its own state, but I'm not sure. Mexico is harder. If anyone could pull off a compromised annexation of Texas, it would be Clay via negotiation with Mexico before he annexed the territory, but I don't think Santa Anna would want to. As a result, the South blocks the acquisition of the Oregon Territory until they have confirmation Clay will annex Texas, and vice versa, forcing his hand and leading to the Mexican-American War. Clay, like most Whigs, did not like this war, but based on the disputes and the expansionist fervor the public had at the time, I think it's somewhat inevitable, though the borders are more variable. For the sake of argument, we'll have Clay take a little less of Texas and California. This upsets the South again, but for now it's the best they can get. Now, this does still have all sorts of congressional problems. Firstly, the Texans and the South as a whole are pissed that they didn't get all of their claims in Mexico, and it sort of renders the Missouri Compromise moot since they don't have any more Western territory to expand into. As a result, Southern expansionists pivot to the Caribbean, and Southern Whigs are still disadvantaged by the Clay administration's moderation. However, Clay also brings back the Free Soil Caucus, since his moderation and general distance from slavery politically makes him an ally of convenience. I also think that a Clay tariff in the 1840s would cause a greater degree of industrialization throughout the Upper South, Virginia and North Carolina specifically. Kentucky might even be pushed out of the South politically and become more grouped in with the Midwest. It was already one of the least slave-based southern states, and it was a major railway hub. Voting for a Whig every single time it was an option. For any Kentuckian viewers, I would like to apologize if you are either very proud of your southern heritage or have never been part of the South in the slightest, depending on your view of the subject. By the end of Clay's term, the Whigs will have found their footing compared to our timeline. While the tariffs are generally more beneficial to the North than the South, their internal improvements are less sectional, and the restoration of the bank and their general hesitation towards expansionism, despite Clay's hands being forced, have made them the party of stability and moderation compared to the relative radicalism of the Democrats. Something generally true no matter what side of the debate two Democrats were on. In effect, the Whigs are held together by a common vision of a single nation, and the Democrats by a united vision of state-right populism. Regardless, I think in 1848, we'd see a Democrat, likely an expansionist, win the race. The Whiggish tendency toward one-term presidents at the time likely weakens the incumbency advantage, and with the moderate deal with Mexico, Southern expansionists would be starving, while Northern moderates likely just want to break from the Whigs. Maybe this Democrat is Polk, maybe it's someone else. However, I think that expansionism is focused squarely on Cuba, maybe with some overtures towards Britain regarding more of Colombia or Maine, but this likely wouldn't be a priority. Whether this is a purchase with a lot of coercion or a war, I don't really know. Actually, I do. It would be a war. Spain made it very clear they weren't selling the island to the US. But if you look very carefully at the world map, you see just how little Spain could actually do if the US forced the issue. Cuba's acquisition is generally attacked by the Whigs, who see it as even more imperialistic than the Mexican-American War. Not only out of partisanship, since the latter was waged by one of their own in this timeline, but because there's no attempt at a sectional balance by acquiring more northern territory. As the 1850s continue, both parties are divided over slavery and expansionism, just like in our timeline. However, here the Free Soil Caucus and party are more intertwined with the Whigs than they were in our timeline, and the Cotton Whigs are weaker due to the industrialization of the Upper South, putting them in a stronger position relative to our timeline. However, this also radicalizes the slavery lobby, since as the Upper South leans further and further away from slavery, that leaves fewer allies for slave power in Congress. States like Virginia and North Carolina still have slavery, but it's becoming more like Kentucky or even industrial slavery versus paid labor. As a result, states like South Carolina, Georgia, and yes, Cuba would have a caged animal mentality during the late antebellum period, and would starve for expansionism. They'd be unlikely to get out of another Democrat after the acquisition of Cuba stoked sectional tension. Come the 1860s, and the Civil War kicks off in a similar position to our timeline, though maybe it's not until 1864. Now, we don't know who the president here is, but I think that due to the changes we've made to the Upper South, and the fact that there's less room for these compromises to create animosity and anger in the North, I think that it would be a conservative free soiler, or even just another president who's unwilling to commit to expansionism, and that forces the South's hand. However, the balance of power is highly altered in this timeline. While the Union retains the United Virginia and North Carolina, the South is at least also a little more industrialized by the necessity of the Clay tariffs. Mostly in Tennessee and Louisiana, but that's still better than nothing. In addition, with Cuba, the South has a similar population to our timeline. I could also see states like Florida and Georgia being somewhat more inclined towards heavy industry, since the antebellum America would need for a larger navy to protect Cuba after the conquest, but at that point it's a stretch. Either way, I think the Civil War lasts for a shorter time than in real life. Maybe 3 years versus 4, but it's difficult to guess. Also, while we're here, I have no idea if France still invades Mexico. Sorry for the quick interruption, but if you're enjoying the video so far, please consider liking and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Also, while this video was chosen by you guys in a poll, I also want to give a shout out to the American System by the Hedgehog on alternatehistory.com. Another timeline about a Whig survival. This video isn't a one-to-one adaptation in the slightest, but if this scenario interests you, I can't recommend the story enough. The different Civil War seriously changes the dynamic of Reconstruction for a few reasons. After all, the Republicans were founded on either the basis of free soil or abolition, whereas the Whigs weren't, even if by now most of them would fall under that umbrella. As a result, I think that instead of an immediate abolition, I think the US is stuck with the Freedom of the Womb Amendment that puts slavery on a timer. After all, the Union has a lot more slaves during the war than it ever did in real life, and Virginia is a lot more important at this point. As a result, while slavery is dealt a fatal blow and abolished throughout the rebellious South, it is also allowed to persist in the middle third of the country, and Reconstruction is likely toned down in the Deep South as a result. Maybe a few states come away a little less horrifying than others, but it's difficult to say. In general, I would imagine this world is worse on racial issues than even our version of the US, which is pretty fucking bad, honestly. Though, to be fair, the loyal southern states wouldn't actually be able to stop a more radical amendment if it were to pass Congress, but I do think it would be harder to bring to a vote due to fears of driving away the border states. Now, I'll be honest. I want to say that this half-assed Reconstruction results in a black interest party forming to challenge the Democratic and Whig duopoly, and maybe it does in Virginia or Louisiana, which would be among the more industrialized states, but realistically, I don't think so. Not because African Americans aren't able to challenge their oppression, but because the legislation wouldn't be available to them for that methodology. It likely requires more political violence by the black population to actually keep the media's attention on them. In addition, I think the Deep and Upper South would see, at least at first, a political divide due to the sectionalism of how slavery was abolished. Reform of the Deep South would be tied into political rights and labor agitation, whereas in the Upper South, which would probably be made more unstable by all of this despite not even seceding, they'd still have to, become free. While it's likely dead by the 1880s, that's still a major hurdle for black people in those states to overcome. Something else to consider is European studying of the Civil War. The great powers of Britain, France, and Prussia were generally unimpressed by the individual battles, but they certainly took heed of the technological developments employed by both sides. Union artillery had a longer range than standard at the time, and rifles on both sides were generally considered superior to what the Europeans were using at the same time. Though, to be fair, those were readily adopted as early as 1866. What really got their attention was the sheer number of men the US mobilized, amassing over 500,000 troops at the height of the war in 1863 due to our railroads and industrial might to support it. In contrast, the Crimean War, fought scarcely a decade before, saw about 600,000 mobilized by the entire Western coalition, and 800,000 by Russia, but considering where that war was fought, I would hope they would mobilize more than their opponents. Though, to be clear, this is another case of Wikipedia's source not being accessible to me, but it'll still be in the citation comment. Regardless, the Prussians especially were quick to apply the logistical lessons to their own army, and come the Franco-Prussian War, would even outdo the US. However, if the Civil War is delayed until 1864, then the Germans have less time to actually apply those lessons to their wars with Austria and France, leaving those wars bloodier than Berlin would like. I'm actually still going to have them win in the long term but make the treaties harsher, since that shows the increased bloodshed and means I don't have to weave a no Germany scenario into this. So, in this timeline, Germany takes a little nugget of Bohemia from Austria, as well as Indochina from France. Bismarck wouldn't be happy about that part in particular, but in this scenario he's succumbing to political pressure from the public more than anything. Somewhat minor in the grand scheme of things, but enough to raise eyebrows in London and Moscow. However, as we move into the Gilded Age, we come across one of the more annoying narrative problems of this timeline. Namely, how similar the Whigs and Republicans really were. The Republicans at the time were the party of civil rights and tariffs, while having a nativistic streak. 2 out of 3 of those apply to the Whigs as well, and the only reason they didn't become a party of civil rights is that they were defunct before Reconstruction, with Whiggish nativism coming from the Know-Nothings. After the Bank War, Northern Whigs more or less focused on tariffs and varying level of free soil politics. In contrast, the Democrats were still the party of free trade, limited federal intervention, and were more willing to dabble in populism, since the immigrants created an urban base that agitated for labor reforms, which Democrats entertained more readily to keep those immigrant voters. Thus, while the economic divergences of Virginian industrialization and the Third National Bank of the US are worth noting, it seems like the broad coalitions are going to be very similar to our timeline. So what are we going to do here? Well, the most obvious way to diverge them would be have the Whigs become the party of labor compared to the Democrats, and with the urban focus of the tariffs and nativism, it almost makes sense. However, I think that the Whigs being so in bed with the bank and the fact that they got their start as the party of social stability versus the vagabond rabble-rousers that Jackson whipped into the Democrats makes this a little out of character for them. Instead, I'm going to introduce a level of corporatism into the Whigs, perhaps inspired by Mexico or France, wherein certain industries are effectively nationalized. Things like rail, increased banking oversight, and possibly nationalized companies for certain infrastructure bills. This would mean unions would negotiate directly with the government, which could be both good and bad. Without a profit incentive, I doubt the bosses would be as radical, but I also imagine that the moderates and those who are on the fence about labor would be even angrier when things get broken. So the US in this world is significantly less liberal, due to a higher degree of protectionism versus free trade, making unions negotiate with the government more or less directly, and the federal government having a greater deal of sway over the basics of the economy. In contrast, the Democrats retain a much more Jacksonian, populistic flair that would oppose the expansion of this corporate model. Though I'm not sure how they would interact with the traditional worker unions when it comes to private industries, which does muddy the water of the party system. I suspect that unions would be very divided compared to our timeline, where industries dominated by the private sector would like the Whigs because they create a standard of certain regulations, whereas the more the federal government becomes overbearing on the union, the more you see those groups turn toward the Democrats. However, agricultural unions and groups like the Populist Party would absolutely jump to the Democrats specifically because of the Whig pressure on the railroad. As a result, if bimetallism, the idea that the US should add a silver standard to the dollar, usually at a ratio of 16 silver to 1 gold, comes into vogue like it did in real life, this group would be just as heavily Democratic as in our timeline. If anything, given the Whigs love the bank, it might even be more of a Democratic lobby, forcing the Whigs more or less into the urban states. Something else that occurs to me is the question of presidential succession. See, in real life, Harrison died a month in, and President Tyler's singular contribution to the Union was enforcing that he was president in full, and that he served out the rest of Harrison's term. Up until this point, however, it was up for debate, and it had a number of acts and amendments made and proposed. The Constitution had the following to say in Article 2. In case of the removal of the President from office or of his death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the Vice President, and Congress may by law provide for the case, removal, death, resignation, or inability, both of the President and Vice President, declaring what officer shall then act as President, and such officer shall act accordingly, until the disability be removed, or President shall be elected. Now, to us nowadays, it's very clear. In the event that the President is unfit for duty, the power in office in full transfer to the Vice President for the rest of the term. However, the phrase, until the disability be removed, or a President shall be elected, does not specify how long the government has in order to host that election. And it is purely by the whim of Tyler and the court that there wasn't a special election or something to that effect. Or that Congress didn't force the title of acting president on him and leave us all to learn the difference in high school. I've also heard that Tyler was petty enough to return mail addressed to the acting president, which I bring up only for comedic effect. Without Harrison's death, it honestly could go either way whenever a president does kick the bucket. Though if it's a Whig and before the Civil War, I feel like their skepticism of the presidency as a whole would lead to a special election. But if the crisis is big enough, or if it's during Reconstruction of all things, they might just let the spare ride out the whole mess for stability. Now, despite the fact that this video has been focused on domestic politics, I think that the world stage is just different enough to comment on. With the Germans taking more of Bohemia and Indochina, when the scramble for Africa comes around, they might be able to push for a bit more land. In this case, I've given them a protectorate over Morocco, and a slightly larger Indochina than France had in 1914. With Mexico retaining western Texas and southern California, you'd think they'd be doing better, and they may well be. But when you factor in their abysmal literacy, I'm not sure. While normally I would assume that the US joins the Entente, I do want to keep this timeline distinct from ours, so how do we get the US into the Central Powers? Well, if we assume that the US still has a large German immigrant community, which is entirely plausible, and that the German colonial expansion is focused more on Africa and Indochina than the Caribbean and Pacific, we might be able to pull off neutrality. But I think we need Britain to be more hostile to American shipping and force them away from even neutral ports, possibly opening fire. That is a massive stretch, but frankly I assume that you guys want things to happen. Once the US is brought into the war, this is very bad for Britain and France. The US will quickly roll over Canada this time around, especially since most of their troops are off in the fields of Flanders. The Entente loses a massive supply of goods and food, damning morale, and Britain suddenly finds itself outmanned in terms of naval production. I don't think the US annexes Canada or anything. If anything, they impose a Republican government in the country and make it more of a puppet state. Their stance on the German gains in the war will be moderate, since I don't think the US will have nearly as much leverage as it did over Britain and France in real life. No real forces on the continent, and the fact that Germany was mostly just fighting without their aid will do that. Unfortunately, I don't think I can really make any predictions about the 1920s or the Great Depression in this timeline. The US economy is just under a completely different model compared to real life. Remember, a lot of its basic industries are more or less run by the government, much more than it ever has in real life, in addition to protectionism and a national bank versus the independent treasury and Federal Reserve respectively. And that's before we factor in that the war with the Entente would likely cause a much smaller bubble compared to the massive weight of our Great War. Considering the differences in the economic and geopolitical situation have evolved well past a Whig survival, I think I'm going to have to end the scenario here. With 8 years of powerful Whig sentiment from Harrison and Clay forcing the industrialization of the Upper South and stunting American expansionism as an ideology, hence a smaller Texas and California, even in spite of getting Cuba, everything is radically diverged. A loyal Upper South blunting abolitionism and leaving race relations even worse than in real life. The Whigs have pulled the US away from the liberal capitalism that's nearly synonymous with the country in our timeline, and created a quasi-corporatist state that forces unions to work with and under the aegis of the government. As a result, the country that entered the Great War as a German ally was a completely different beast than Wilson's America was when it reluctantly saved the British and French empires. Before we go, thank you to channel members MigHi01, Daikami, Nebula, Nafumato, and Grimwalt, with a special thank you to Grimwalt for joining at the exclamation point level. Thank you guys for watching, and join me next time as we explore another alternate world.